a schoolteacher with a dead husband's name and $40, a sheep rancher who had stopped believing one season could be different from the last, and a piece of paper neither of them knew existed until it became the only thing standing between the ranch and the man who wanted it. Nobody in Copper Falls, Montana expected Nell Garver to last past the first hard frost. She came off the afternoon stage in October with a single trunk, a box of books she hadn't been able to part with, and the self-possession of a woman who has already lost the thing she feared most and discovered that surviving it was not, in fact, the end of her. The man who'd sent for her didn't meet the stage. A ranch hand named Gil Oates came instead, lean, about 60, with a weathered face, and the economy of motion that comes from decades of outdoor work. He collected her trunk without introduction and loaded it into the back of a wagon without ceremony. "You're the schoolteacher," he said. "Not a question." "Nell Garver," she said. "Where is Mr. Burnett?" "East pasture. Eway in trouble." Gil climbed onto the seat and picked up the reins. "He'll be at supper." She climbed up beside him, and they drove out of town in the late afternoon light, the wagon wheels cutting through mud that had partially frozen at the edges. The mountains to the west were going orange and pink in the kind of display that didn't care whether anyone was watching. She watched them anyway. Nell had been a schoolteacher in Havre for 6 years, and a teacher's wife before that, and she was 30 years old, and her husband Eli had been dead for 8 months. Killed in a tunnel collapse at the Meridian copper mine in March, along with 4 other men. The company had sent a letter of condolence and a sum of money that covered 2 months of rent on the house they'd shared. After that, she was on her own, which was not a new condition for her, but was a more immediate one than it had been in a while. She'd answered 3 correspondence advertisements before Cade Burnett's. 2 of them had felt wrong in the letters, too eager in one direction or too cold in another. Burnett's had been brief: sheep operation in Copper Falls, 80 acres in the valley, additional grazing rights east. Looking for a capable woman, honest about the situation. Ranch is working, not prosperous, no children, right if interested, she'd written. His reply had been 2 paragraphs, factual, no pretense. She appreciated the no pretense. The Burnett place came into view as the last of the light was leaving. A 2-story log house with a stone foundation, a large barn, and 3 smaller outbuildings arranged around a central yard. The sheep pens ran along the south side of the barn, built solid. The fences she could see in the failing light were in mixed condition, some sections tight and recent, some leaning. There was a kitchen garden gone to frost, and a woodpile that was lower than it ought to have been in October. She looked at all of it the way she looked at a new classroom on the first day of a school year, taking inventory, noting what was there and what was missing and what would need attention first. Gil unloaded her trunk and carried it inside without being asked. She followed. The house was plain and clean in the way that places become when a single person has learned to maintain them out of necessity rather than preference. A large front room with a stone fireplace, a table, 4 chairs, a bookshelf with 24 volumes, an oil lamp turned low on the mantel beside a stack of papers that hadn't been filed anywhere. She noticed the papers. In her experience, papers that hadn't been filed were either unimportant or too important to look at directly. There was a woman's shawl on a hook by the kitchen door that had been there long enough to gather dust. She noted that too, and said nothing about it. Cade Burnett came in 40 minutes later, while she was in the kitchen looking through the stores. She heard the door, heard boots on the floor, and came out to meet him. He was taller than she'd pictured, 40, maybe a few years past, dark-haired, sharp-faced, with the particular leanness of a man who works outdoors in all weather and eats whatever's convenient. There was something in the set of his jaw and around his eyes that spoke of long practice at not showing what he was thinking. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had prepared for this moment and found, now that it had arrived, that preparation hadn't entirely covered it. "Miss Garver," he said. "Mrs. Garver," she said, not sharply, just accurately, though I'm not particular about it. He nodded once. The ewe pulled through. She'll keep the lamb. He moved to the washstand by the door and cleaned his hands. "I should have sent word if I was going to be late. I didn't think." "Jill met me," she said. "It's fine." He dried his hands and looked at her steadily. "The situation is what I wrote. I didn't embellish." "I didn't expect you to." She held his look. "I didn't embellish either." Something in the set of his shoulders eased slightly. Not much, but enough to notice. There's salt pork and beans, he said. I can. I'll cook, she said. Tell me where things are. He told her. She cooked. They ate at the kitchen table in the uncertain quiet of two people who don't know each other yet and have agreed, by sitting down together, to begin. The food was simple, and there wasn't quite enough of it, which told her something about the household economy without a word being spoken. She filed it next to the woodpile and the unfiled papers and the dusty shawl. What happened to your husband? He asked at one point. Practical, not prying, asking the way people ask when the information matters. Mining accident, she said. 8 months ago. I'm sorry. Thank you. She meant it, and the woman who was here before. His face did something complicated and quiet. Eleanor left 3 years ago. She took what was in the account and went east. He said it without drama. I don't know where she is now. Nell nodded. She didn't push. Some things needed more time before they were ready to be spoken, and some things never got there at all, and you learned to tell the difference. After supper, she sat at the kitchen table with the small notebook she carried everywhere and went through what she'd observed. Left column, what was wrong. Right column, what was possible. The right side was shorter, but it wasn't empty. The sheep operation itself was sounder than the house. She'd seen that from the wagon. The pens were well built, the flock healthy-looking in the dusk. But the wool records on the shelf were disorganized. The grazing rotation hadn't been formally planned in years, and there was a debt to a feed supplier in Billings that Cade had mentioned in passing at supper, the way people mention debts they've gotten used to carrying. She wrote it all down. Then she went to bed in the small back room and lay awake listening to the wind off the mountains, thinking about the stack of papers on the mantel. In the morning, she was up before him. She rebuilt the kitchen fire and stood at the window while the coffee came up, watching the gray light define the shapes of the ranch around her. The sheep were moving in the south pen. The mountains were half hidden in cloud. A creek ran somewhere in the distance, audible only in the stillness before the working day began. She spent 3 days on the records. She found 7 years of breeding tallies, 3 years of shearing logs, and a careful notebook in a woman's handwriting. Eleanor's, she assumed, that tracked the flock's health and yield from 1882 to 1886, with the precision of someone who understood what she was managing. The entries stopped in late summer of 1886, just stopped. The last entry was about a ewe with a good lamb, noted as a keeper. Nell read the whole notebook through. It was, in its way, a blueprint for what the flock had been and could be again. She left it on the desk without mentioning it to Cade. When he came in that evening and saw it there, he stopped. I found it in the filing box, she said from across the room. The records in there are good. She knew the flock. He didn't say anything for a moment. She did, he said. And then he went to wash up for supper, and neither of them said anything else about it. She met Vera Peel at the Copper Falls General Store the following week. Vera ran the store and everything adjacent to it, and had the sharp eyes of someone who heard most of the things people thought they were keeping to themselves. You're Cade's woman, Vera said, by way of greeting. Nell Garver, Nell said. I arrived last week. Vera looked at her the way she might look at a questionable piece of merchandise, thorough, without apology. Then she arrived at a verdict. Coffee? They talked for an hour. Nell learned the valley, the growing season, the feed suppliers, the politics of the grazing rights on the eastern boundary. She also learned, from the careful, neutral way Vera spoke, that Cade's older brother Porter had been making inquiries around town about the Burnett property for the better part of a year. What kind of inquiries? Nell asked. Vera set down her coffee cup. The kind a man makes when he thinks something might become available. Nell went back to the ranch that afternoon and picked up the papers from the mantel. There were 7 documents in the stack. Most were what she'd expected: a land deed, a tax receipt, a letter about the outstanding feed account. But the 4th document was a promissory note dated 18 months ago. She read it carefully, twice. Cade had borrowed $300 from his brother Porter. The note outlined the repayment terms. At the bottom, in small print that required the lamp turned high to read comfortably, there was a default clause. Both men had signed it. She put the papers back exactly as she had found them. That evening, After supper, she said, "The promissory note with your brother's name on it." Cade went still. "I looked at it," she said. "I should have asked first. I'm sorry for that." He was quiet long enough that she began to count it. "He's been saying the note gives him a claim on the eastern pasture," Cade said finally. "If I don't pay in full by the 1st of April. That's what he says the note says. That's what he told me." Nell looked at him carefully. She had been a teacher for 6 years, and the lesson she'd learned earliest was that the space between what a document said and what someone said it said was very often where the actual trouble lived. "Can I read it to you?" she said, quietly, no particular inflection, not an offer that assumed anything, just an offer. He looked at her across the table. His face had the expression she'd seen in students who needed help with something they didn't know how to ask for, a compound of pride and exhaustion, and the slow calculation of whether the asking was worth what it would cost. "Yes," he said. She got the note. She read it aloud, every word, in the even tone she'd used for textbooks, the legal language, the amounts, the dates, the terms, all of it. When she reached the default clause, she read it twice. Then she set the paper down and looked at him. "The clause requires the full sum by April 1st, she said, but it also requires a written demand delivered to the debtor 30 days prior. In person, with a witness." She kept her voice level. "Has Porter sent you a written demand?" Cade's expression shifted. "He came by last month, told me the clock was running." "In person?" "Yes." "Did he bring a witness?" A pause. "No." "Did he bring anything in writing?" Another pause, longer. "No," he said. Nell folded the note along its original crease. "Then the default clause isn't enforceable yet. He hasn't followed the procedure it requires." She set the paper on the table between them. "He may not know that you know that, or he may be counting on you not to read the fine print." The silence that followed was different from the other silences they'd shared. It had something in it that was still settling. "I should have had someone read that before I signed it," Cade said. His voice was flat and controlled, and she understood the flatness was what steadiness looked like in a man working hard to maintain it. "Maybe," she said, "but you have it read now." He looked at the note on the table. Then he looked at her with an expression that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite gratitude and was more complicated than either, the look of a person who has been carrying a thing alone and has just discovered they don't have to anymore and isn't yet sure what to do with that. "He'll come here," Cade said. "When he finds out the sale isn't happening, he'll come and make his case in person." "I know," Nell said. "Let him." The winter set in the following week and didn't apologize for itself. Nell learned the rhythms of a sheep operation the way she'd always learned things, watching first, then asking, then doing. She learned the signs of foot rot and how to treat it, learned the grazing rotation, learned the names Cade used for each section of the east pasture and why each one mattered. She also learned Cade Burnett. He was not a man who talked much, but he was a man who paid attention in the way of people who process the world through observation rather than speech. She saw it in how he moved through the barn, every animal noted, nothing overlooked. In how he handled the flock, patient in a way that wasn't gentleness exactly, but competence close enough to gentleness that the animals didn't distinguish between them. In how, after the 3rd week, he stopped positioning himself as if waiting for her to announce she was leaving. One night in December, a ewe went into labor with complications. Nell found out when she heard Cade's voice from the barn at 2 in the morning, not calling for her, just talking to the animal in the low, steady tone he used when something was wrong. She dressed and went out. They worked until 4 in the morning. Both lambs lived. The ewe lived. Nell sat on an overturned crate in the barn afterward, with hay on her coat, and watched Cade settle the ewe into clean bedding, and thought about how a person's actual quality, not the version they presented, was clearest in moments like this. Quiet moments, where there was no audience and nothing to gain from performing well. "You should have called me sooner," she said. "Didn't know you'd want to be called." "For 2 lambs in trouble in December," she looked at him, "the flock is part of why I'm here." He crouched beside the ewe and checked the lambs one more time. "Part of it," he said. He didn't say what the other part was. She didn't ask. But they walked back to the house in the dark with their breath-making clouds in the cold air. And there was a different quality to the silence between them. Less the silence of two strangers sharing space, and more the silence of two people who have been through something together and don't need to talk about it. Porter Burnett came on a Thursday in late January, exactly as Nell had expected. She saw him ride up from the kitchen window, a heavy-set man on a good horse, wearing a coat that said something about how much of his own money he kept and how much he expected other people to provide. She got to the door before he knocked. He looked slightly surprised. He covered it quickly. "Mrs. Garver," he said. He'd done his research. "Mr. Burnett," she said. "Come in." She didn't go to the barn for Cade. She let Porter in, offered coffee, let him look around the kitchen the way he was going to regardless. Then she set 2 cups on the table and sat down, and Porter sat down, and she took the promissory note from the shelf, where she'd moved it 3 days ago, and laid it flat on the table between them. "The default clause," she said, "the 30-day written demand, the witness requirement." She looked at him. "Has that demand been delivered?" Something in Porter's face changed. "The terms are clear," he said. "They are," Nell agreed. "That's why I read them 3 times. She smoothed the note with one hand, the written demand in person with a witness 30 days prior. Not a conversation, a written demand. She looked at him. "We haven't received one." Porter looked at the note. He looked at her. He was recalculating, the way a man recalculates when he realizes the person across the table has read what he assumed they hadn't. "There are other ways to interpret the clause," he said. "There might be," she said, "but interpreting legal documents is a job for lawyers, and paying lawyers cost both parties. I'm not sure that's in anyone's interest here." The door opened. Cade came in still in his work coat. He looked at Porter, then at Nell, then at the note on the table. "Porter," he said. "Cade." Porter's voice had shifted, controlled now, recalibrated. "Your Mrs. Garver has some questions about the terms." "She read them," Cade said. He crossed to the table and stood behind Nell's chair, not theatrical about it, just present. "What are your thoughts on the witness requirement?" Porter was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up his hat. "The account should be settled by April," he said. "I'm willing to discuss terms." "We'll have a proposal for you before March," Nell said, "in writing." Porter left. The door closed. The kitchen held its quiet. Cade stood there a moment, then pulled out the chair beside her and sat down heavily, the way a person sits when they've been holding something up for a long time and have finally put it down. "Before March," he said. "The spring shearing," she said. "The forecast prices are up from last year. If we can get the flock through February in better condition, the eastern pasture rotation hasn't been managed right in 2 seasons. If we shift the breeding ewes to the south section for 6 weeks and give the east pasture a rest, the spring grass comes in stronger. Stronger grass, heavier lambs, better yield at market." She turned the note over in her hands. "We can settle his claim without the eastern pasture changing hands." He looked at her across the table. "You worked that out already," he said. "I've been working it out since November," she said. "I didn't say anything until I was sure." He was quiet for a moment. "The note," he said. "When you asked to read it to me, you already knew." "I guessed," she said carefully. "I didn't know." He looked at the table. She waited, because she understood this was the kind of moment that needed to arrive in its own time. "My mother taught me to read," he said. "She died when I was 12. What she got to teach me was enough to get by." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "Enough to run a ranch, not always enough for the fine print." "It's enough," she said. "The fine print is just words, and you have someone here who can read words." He looked at her, and the look had something in it she'd been seeing in pieces for weeks. In the way he'd started leaving the lamp on in the kitchen when he knew she'd be up late working. In the way he'd found better quality hay for the barn, without mentioning it until she asked. In the way he'd noticed, sometime in December, that her wool socks had a hole in the heel and had set a pair of Eleanor's old socks on the washstand outside her door without a word. "The socks," she said. He looked slightly caught. "I noticed," she said, "in December. I didn't say anything because I wasn't sure you'd want me to." "I wanted to," he said. "I just didn't know how to say it." She understood he was not talking only about the socks. February was its own kind of trial, not a crisis, just the grinding endurance of a season that has gone on long enough that the body forgets what warm felt like. Nell kept her list. She crossed things off and added new things and kept going. She reorganized the wool store records by shearing year and found, buried in Eleanor's old notebook, a note about a particular bloodline in the breeding stock that had produced consistently strong lambs. She mentioned it to Cade. He knew exactly which ewe descended from that line. They set her aside for the best breeding. In the evenings, he read with her. It had started without ceremony. She'd been reading aloud from the valley's agricultural bulletin one night, information about spring pasture management, and he'd moved his chair closer to follow along. After that, it was simply a thing they did. She read, he followed, and when he could manage a passage himself, he did, and when he couldn't, she made nothing of it. Some evenings they got through several pages. Some evenings they talked instead, and the reading was just the reason to be in the same room. She told him about Eli. Not all of it, but the parts that were ready to be told. The 9 years of a marriage that had been good in the ways that mattered. She told him about the mine and the letter from the company, and the morning she understood it was permanent. He told her about Eleanor, what he understood of it, which wasn't everything. That she'd been lonely and he'd been too absorbed in the ranch to notice until it was too late to change. That he didn't blame her in the simple way, but didn't entirely forgive himself either. That the hardest part hadn't been the money she'd taken. It had been the ledger notebook she'd left behind, full of her careful handwriting about a flock she'd invested herself in and then walked away from. She left it deliberately, he said. I always thought so. I never knew if it was a reproach or a gift. Both can be true at the same time, Nell said. He considered that for a long while. The spring shearing came in early April. Cade hired 2 extra hands for the week, and Nell kept the tally book. Every animal, every pound, every count. She had reorganized the records so that this year's totals could be compared directly against Eleanor's numbers from the good years. The comparison was not flattering, but it was better than last year, and last year had been better than the year before. When the wool buyer came up from Billings, he looked at the flock's condition and offered $2 more per hundredweight than he'd offered the previous spring. Nell wrote the number in the tally book. Afterward, when the buyer had gone and the hands had packed up and the ranch was quiet again, she sat at the kitchen table and did the arithmetic one final time. The wool revenue, the remaining feed costs, Porter's note. It was enough, more than enough to clear the note, not by a great amount, but ahead was ahead, and ahead was what they'd been working toward since October. Cade came in while she was still adding the final column. He looked at the tally book and at her face, which had apparently gone readable, because he stopped in the middle of taking off his coat. Well, he said. She told him the number. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he hung his coat on the hook, slowly, deliberately, the way a person does when they need a second to process something, and came to the table and looked at the numbers himself. Paid clear, he said. Paid clear, she agreed. He sat down across from her. He had a long day's worth of work on his face and hay on his sleeve, and something in his eyes that she'd been watching build since November, the look of a man who has slowly, reluctantly, stopped waiting for the next thing to go wrong. Nell, he said. I know, she said, because she did know. I want to say it. He looked at her directly. When I wrote that advertisement, I was trying to save the ranch. I wasn't thinking past that. He paused. I've been thinking past that for a while now. She looked at this man who had sat up all night in a cold barn for 2 lambs, who had set Eleanor's old socks outside her door without asking for anything in return, who had learned to read fine print, letter by letter, in the lamplight of winter evenings, without once asking her to pretend it wasn't happening. So have I, she said. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and it was the simplest possible thing, and it was enough. They married in June in the Copper Falls Church, with Vera Peel and Gil Oates as witnesses. It was not a large wedding. The vows were brief, and the lunch afterward was at the store, and Vera made a cake from the season's first berries that was better than anything the occasion required. Porter Burnett did not come. He sent a letter of congratulation that Cade handed to Nell without opening it, and she read it aloud, formal, correct, no warmth in it, and then set it aside. His claim on the eastern pasture had dissolved with the payment in April, and he had not been back since. The summer was good. The pasture rotation Nell had planned in winter produced the strong grass she'd expected, and the lambs from the protected breeding stock were, as Eleanor's notebook had predicted they would be, better than average. The eastern pasture held. The fences held. The flock went into autumn at a weight that made the winter feed costs predictable rather than alarming. In September, Nell found a second notebook in Eleanor's handwriting, tucked in the back of the wool store records, a planning book with sketches for a second lambing pen she had intended to build, notes on wind shelter and drainage worked out in careful detail. Nell left it on the kitchen table one evening without comment, the way she'd left the first one. Cade found it that night. She heard him reading through it at the table while she was in the next room. After a while, he called to her. "The second pen," he said. "She wanted it on the north side of the barn." "I know," Nell said from the doorway. She was right about the drainage. He looked at the notebook, then at her. "We could put it in this fall if the ground stays workable long enough." "We could," she said. He nodded, closed the notebook, and set it beside the lamp. "She would have been glad someone read it," he said. "I think so too," Nell said. That was the whole of it, she thought. Not the spring shearing, or the settled debt, or the afternoon. Porter had looked at the promissory note and understood that his position was not what he'd believed it to be. Not the wedding in June, or the summer's good lambs, or the fence line that held. All of those things mattered, but the whole of it was the notebook left on a table and read, the socks left on a washstand, the lamp kept burning, the man sitting in lamplight in February, moving his lips carefully over difficult words. The whole of it was the 1,000 small things that said, without ceremony, "I am here and I intend to keep being here." Said so many times in so many small ways that eventually they added up to something you couldn't mistake for anything else. The second pen went up in October, solid, on the north side of the barn exactly where Eleanor's sketch had placed it. The drainage was good. Nell added it to the right side of her list, the side for what was possible, and drew a clean line through it. Then she turned the page and started a new one.